The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Hey, Malcolm, you know that Audible's got a lot more than audiobooks?
Of course, podcasts,
Originals.
bestsellers,
Future bestsellers.
sleep stories.
Sleep story. What are you talking about, sleep story? Malcolm. Oh, wow. Malcolm. Malcolm. Hey, no, Roxy. Hey, Roxy, get out of Malcolm's house.
The most inspiring minds, the most compelling stories, all in one place. Audible.
Hi, I'm Annalisa Cox. I'm an historian with Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, and I'll be hosting today's panel. I specialize in the history of racism in 19th century America, and I thank you all for tuning in to the 26th Annual Festival of Books and our virtual event, History, Racism, and Exclusion in the United States, with Alice Baumgartner, Assistant Professor of History at USC, who holds an MPhil in History from Oxford and a PhD from Yale. And she is 2020 LA Times Book Prize finalist for her book, South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War. Walter Johnson, critically acclaimed author, Winthrop Professor of History, and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and 2020 LA Times Book Prize finalist for his book, The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. And finally, Martha S. Jones, Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, former co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women's Historians, the oldest and largest association of women historians in the United States, and 2020 LA Times Book Prize winner in history for Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Before we get started with the conversation, I want to remind everyone to support your local independent bookstores during the festival. A limited supply of book plates signed by these authors is available with your book purchase from Skylight Books. Alice, Walter, and Martha, welcome. Your books all bring a fresh and very timely perspective on the past, and I admire all the work you put into them. I'm going to invite each of you to read a brief section from your book to get us started. Alice, then Walter, then Martha. Alice, would you go ahead?
Thanks so much, Annalisa. I'm going to read something from the very beginning of the book. No one knew how the two sailors escaped, whether they risked swimming from the Metacomet, anchored in the deep water off the port of Veracruz, Mexico, or whether someone had rowed them to shore under cover of darkness. It was the summer of 1857, and the Metacomet was due back in its home port of New Orleans, where another shipment of cotton awaited transport to Mexican markets. But the steamship could not leave Veracruz without the two missing sailors, and the shipmaster had reason to fear that the men were gone for good. Although it had become routine for Mexican authorities to arrest seamen who broke their contracts, George and James Frisbee were no ordinary deserters. They were Black slaves, brothers in fact, hired out by their owner in Louisiana. If George and James Frisbee had escaped to New York or Boston, they would have been returned if captured under the U.S. Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Acts. But Mexico's laws offered no such guarantees. Not only had Mexico abolished slavery, but its laws freed the slaves of other countries from the moment they set foot on its soil. To have any chance of returning the Frisbee brothers, the shipmaster of the Metacomet avoided mentioning that the two men were enslaved. Assuming that the missing sailors were ordinary deserters, the local police promptly apprehended George. But his brother proved harder to find. As the police searched the streets and alleyways of Veracruz, James hid inside of a house. Nothing is known for certain about the house or its owners, though there's reason to believe that while in hiding, James learned about Mexico's anti-slavery laws, because when the police finally found him, he did something that his brother did not. He claimed his freedom, ironically, by producing evidence of his enslavement. Since Mexican law abolished slavery and freed all enslaved people who set foot on its soil, the commander of the port of Veracruz refused to arrest James, even when the US ambassador to Mexico protested that the incident would undermine the, quote, increasing and beneficent commerce, close quote, between Mexico and the US South. Much more was at stake than commercial relations. The freedom that Mexico promised would threaten slavery, not just in the nearby states of Texas and Louisiana, but at the very heart of the Union.
Thank you. Walter.
Thank you. I am also going to read from the very beginning of my book from a section called Mapping the Loss. The architectural history of a once great city lies packed into crates in a warehouse near Cahokia, Illinois. Molded cement pediments, stained in structural glass, ornamental cast iron, wrought iron, and mild steel. Stone columns, friezes, reliefs, and figural sculptures, doors, window frames, and full wooden staircases. Remnants of banks and breweries, churches and courthouses, dairies, department stores, and foundries, greenhouses, hotels, and hospitals, libraries, mortuaries, and museums, pavilions, post offices, and poorhouses, schools, stadiums, and steel mills, all of the row houses that lined one side of a downtown square. The red brick Gothic classicism of the Little Sisters of the Poor and the Beaux-Arts Lindell department store, the Ralston Checkerboard Company's grain elevator, and the fortress-like First District Police Station, the 19th century skyscrapers that once lined Real Estate Row, the city of St. Louis torn down, pieced out into elements, cataloged, and packed into crates, the archaeological remainder of a city that once harbored the ambition of being among the world's greatest, carefully curated by a visionary demo man, perhaps awaiting the city's second coming. Across the Mississippi River, back in the city of St. Louis itself, the pieces of the past lie jumbled together and scattered around the foundation of the city's 30,000 vacant houses, their windows boarded up and their roofs collapsed in upon themselves. Many of these houses have been repossessed by the city and delegated to the St. Louis Land Clearance for Redevelopment Authority for resale. Some can be bought for as little as $1. Thousands of poorly maintained parcels of property on the city's north side have been bought up by neighbors or speculators. The population of the city today is just over 300,000, roughly the same number as in 1870 and around 1/3 of the total in 1850. The city has been left behind by its population. Middle-class whites and some of their Black neighbors moved to the suburbs. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods of poor Black St. Louisans and some of their white neighbors have been torn down around them. It is a truism that the struggles of American cities in the second half of the 20th century were due to white flight. And there is no doubt that St. Louis whites moved out of the city in droves in the years following the Second World War. But the story of the human geography of St. Louis is as much a story of Black removal, the serial destruction of Black neighborhoods and the transfer of their population according to the reigning model of profit and policing at any given moment, as of white flight. Of the city's abandoned houses, it is perhaps fair to say that they are worth more dead than alive. The deep burgundy bricks, so smooth that they seem almost glazed, molded out of the clay from the pits on the city's south side and fired in the kilns of its famous brickworks around the turn of the century, sell for 50 cents a piece today in cities like New Orleans and Houston. For many years, there was little regulation of the demolition business, and row houses and brownstones containing anywhere from 20 to 40,000 bricks per piece were easy money for anyone with a pry bar and a pickup. Even today, when demolition companies must be licensed and tear-downs authorized, there are rogue demo men, brick rustlers, who break into abandoned houses to steal the copper wiring, the iron plumbing, and the lead counterweights out of the window frames. Some will set an old house on fire, knowing that the water from the firemen's hoses will soften the mortar, making the bricks easier to salvage and scrape clean for sale. So many of the houses in North St. Louis have been torn down that some of the neighborhoods look like rural farmsteads, clusters of houses here and there surrounded by open space. St. Louis today has the highest murder rate in the nation, around 4 times the rate in Chicago and 13th highest in the world, and the highest rate of police shooting in the nation. There is an 18-year difference in life expectancy between a child born to a family living in the almost completely Black Jeff Vanderloo neighborhood in North St. Louis and a child born to a family living in the majority white suburb of Cleveland, which sits less than 10 miles to the west. Indeed, significant differences in virtually any marker of social well-being, rates of adult diabetes or childhood asthma, levels of lead in the bloodstream, or broadband internet access can be charted down a single line, Delmar Avenue, which bisects the city between north and south, between Black and white. Just over the city line, St. Louis County boasts 3 of the 25 wealthiest suburbs in the United States, Town and Country, Ladue, and Frontenac. Back in the city, standing on streets that, depending on the block, can tend to lead the nation in the density of accidents involving pedestrians, gun murders, and payday loan stores, it is hard not to wonder what happened here.
Thank you so much, Walter. Martha, your turn.
Thanks, Annalisa. This is a passage from early in Vanguard, a story about my own great-grandmother, Fannie Williams, and one that was really a guide for the book. Even before segregation became baked into the laws of Kentucky, theater operators patrolled the color line, on alert for those who might cross it. First, an usher noticed Fannie. He approached her, and as Fannie explained, went to her in a gruff manner and ordered her to move. Immediately, a contest of wills flared. Fannie, with her sense of dignity and entitlement on one side, and the usher on the other, adamant that a Black woman, even a respectable one, must be put in her place. Fannie ignored him and remained firmly seated with her back erect and her eyes fixed straight ahead until a local marshal arrived. He repeated the usher's admonition. Fannie retorted. She asked him politely to tell her why she was not allowed to sit where she was, as she did not think she was harming anyone by sitting there. Her words were both a query and a challenge. What happened next might suggest that Fannie had studied law rather than classics at Berea College. The marshal repeated his order. She was to move to the aisle across the way, the colored section. Why was she being ordered to move? By what authority? By whose power? Papers later reported that Fannie denounced the marshal in strong terms, though she never devolved into the use of indecent or profane language. A confrontation of words turned physical when the marshal, fed up with Fannie's challenge to his authority, caught her roughly by the arm and led her to the door. In the days that followed, officials charged her with disorderly conduct, a mark that might have threatened her future as a teacher. She sought advice from friends who counseled that she pay the fine and cost to resolve the dispute. And she did, though all the while maintaining that the blame lay with the men whose gruffness had provoked her flash of temper. Even today, my own temper boils when I imagine Fannie, fresh from her triumph at Berea College in 1888, being manhandled for having taken her preferred seat in a theater. She might have believed that education, including the mastery of Greek and Latin, could exempt her from the color line. She may have hoped that class, her dress, deportment, and taste in popular entertainment would insulate her from the degradations of Jim Crow. If she did, Fannie was wrong. Did she have a right to be a lady? Did she have a right in 1889 Pulaski, Kentucky to don a fine dress, stroll the blocks to a public venue, take the seat of her choosing, and then be treated to an evening of learning and leisure? Could she expect an usher to offer his arm or sweep her seat free of dust? Could she turn to a marshal as a safeguard against other men's gruffness? No, racism was a brutal leveler that transformed a young woman's evening out into a contest over what rights Black women had, if indeed they had any at all.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all three of you. Those are wonderful readings. I asked you to do this today because, in addition to being incredibly good historians, you're also wonderful writers. And I wanted the audience to have a chance to hear your unique voices. But back to that question of historians and what it means to be an historian, because it is a craft, right? And in this day and age when we often question facts, when fake news seems so deeply entrenched, historians are really kind of holding the line in going and actually using their craft to find facts. So this next question, I'm going to start with Martha, but I'd like it to be to each one of you. So it's going to be first Martha, then Walter, then Alice. And I can repeat the question if needed. History is a craft. What is the fact or narrative that you discovered that surprised you the most? And how did you find it? Martha.
Thanks for that. I think there are two ways to answer that question. The first is to confess that there are things I did not find that I went looking for in writing Vanguard. As this story about Fannie Williams suggests, I began this book by looking for the women in my own family. And part of what I discovered was the degree to which the archives, the records, those sources that we rely upon as historians to construct our narratives, to construct our interpretations, had been disappeared. And so I was going to be left to, in a sense, rest on silences in this book, as well as in those remarkable moments in which I am able to actually reconstruct stories from the past. I shared this bit of Fannie Williams's story, and that was a revelation to me because as much as I thought I knew about the women in my own family, this was not a story that had been passed down through lore. This was not a story that was shared at the dinner table. It was a story that had been tucked away, perhaps hidden away even, and not passed across the generations. So part of what's extraordinary about the work that we do and the archive is that even when we think we know a story well, it turns out that there's a great deal yet to discover.
Yeah, that's a terrifying prospect to how much we leave behind, which I think is good to sit with and to remember. For a long time, because I'm a professional historian, I guess I felt like I was under some kind of imperative to have my book have an argument. But for a long time, I think that what I told people the argument of my book was just, can you believe this? Because the things that I was finding out about St. Louis were both so, in some cases, so shocking, and in some cases, so inspiring to me. I think that as far as an archival find, the probably the most extraordinary thing that I came across that was just not really known by previous historians was a simple document, a single-page document, which was a letter that a bunch of progressive white and Black activists had sent to the League of Women Voters, asking them for help in resettling 20,000 people who were about 20,000 Black people who were about to be unhoused by the demolition of their neighborhood, Mill Creek Valley. And the part that was extraordinary was the pencil notation in perfect penmanship of the type that I was familiar with growing up from the chairwoman of the League of Women Voters in St. Louis, a wealthy white woman that said, "My answer is no," underlined. So there would be no help given in resettlement. I think the most shocking thing that I discovered, which is known among some but not widely known, is that the United States Army tested airborne radiological weapons in the city of St. Louis repeatedly from the 1950s on, and concertedly in the Pruitt-Igoe housing project in 1963 and 1964. And that was a shock to me, although when I frame that according to my standard argument, can you believe this, to one of the legacy activists in St. Louis who I came to know. I was lucky enough to get to know and talk to quite a bit over the course of the project, Percy Green. He said that's how they do it. It was not something that he had known, but it was not something that surprised him. The thing that I probably take away the most, having not anticipated but learned a great deal about in the course of writing the book, is the long radical history of St. Louis. A radical history that dates back to the history of communists, German emigre communists during the Civil War, through the first general strike in the United States, through the Communist Party in the early 20th century, and the alliance of African American working women and communists, and a successful strike in 1933 at Funston Nut, the city's largest employer of Black women, and then through the history of the 40s and 50s and up to the present day. And I think it's actually possible, if you talk to the activists, both the Ferguson activists or the legacy activists like Percy Green, to see them drawing on prior struggles. And so I think it's fair to say that there is actually the tradition, the Black radical tradition in St. Louis was the thing that was, to me, something that I hadn't thought as much about as I should have going into the book, that I learned about, and then that really came to shape it in the end.
Well, like Martha, I also struggled with the fact that there's so much that we don't know about enslaved people escaping to Mexico. But because this escape route spanned from the United States to Mexico, I was lucky in that I was able to draw from archives both in the United States and Mexico, and to cross-reference what I found in one national archive or local archive against what I had found in archives in the other country. And that proved very, very useful, because the archives in Texas and Louisiana tend to discount the importance of enslaved people escaping to Mexico. And there's understandable reasons for that. That enslavers in Texas and Louisiana found it much easier to believe, as they often stated in newspapers, that enslaved people, yes, were escaping to Mexico, but weren't finding real freedom there. And that, in fact, many of those enslaved people came back to Texas, so they claimed, because they didn't like what they found in Mexico. In Mexican archives, I was able to find a more complicated story, in that there were enslaved people who went to Mexico and then returned to Texas, but they weren't returning to stay. And I'll give just one example of a man who had escaped from Texas to the northeastern Mexican state of Coahuila, and he became a blacksmith hired by the state to fix tools and fix weapons for a military colony, sort of a fort on Mexico's northern border. And as part of his contract, which I found in a local archive in that state, it said that he had permission to leave his work for a number of months to go back to Texas to help his brother escape. And we have evidence to suggest that he did that, and that his brother came with him to Mexico and joined his blacksmithing business there.
That's an amazing story, Alice. And I just wanted to quick follow up on that, because this is your first book. And all of us historians here, we use phrases like visit the archive, find this paper. But for a whole lot of people in the audience and for Americans, that kind of seems magical and mysterious. Could you just very briefly describe what it was like to go into that archive where you found that story? Where did you find that story? What document was it on? If you could just briefly describe that, I'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So this was in the state archives of a state in northeastern Mexico called Coahuila. And what's really wonderful about working in Mexican archives is that the Mexican government has spent a lot of money to organize the papers and preserve the papers that they have from their history. And so I was able to go to these archives that are incredibly well organized, with staff that were incredibly helpful. And it was so helpful, and I really couldn't have written this book, as I'm sure Walter and Martha feel the same way, without the help of archivists. They're so important to what we do. That particular document was part of a collection from archives about those military colonies on Mexico's northern border. And it included all sorts of information about those military colonies helping defend Mexico's northern border from types of foreign invasion, whether that was filibusters from the United States or indigenous peoples raiding from as far north as the Great Plains. And it was within that document that I found this contract, which originally, contracts you come across quite often in the archives, or at least I did, and they're usually quite dry and boring, as you would expect. But it was lucky that this one actually stated some information that clued me in very quickly that it was going to be one of those great archival finds when it almost makes the archive disappear when you realize you found something that is that good and that relevant and that important to your argument.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. So I have another question for the three of you, but I'm going to start with Walter, if I could. With the Oscars coming up, and this being LA, is there one person or narrative that you include in your book that you think would make a good film, and why?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, it's so difficult to choose from all of the possibilities. But I think that the story that I just alluded to about this labor struggle at Funston Nut and the relationship between the Black woman who really was the key organizer, Carrie Smith, and William Sentner, who was a communist organizer in St. Louis, because they faced a problem together. And that problem was trying to use the Communist Party to organize very, very sincerely Christian workers. And so the alliance that Carrie Smith made with the communists was an alliance that meant that the traditional sort of structures existing in a lot of Black St. Louis through the churches were not going to support the strike, and nor were some of the middle class Black organizations like the Urban League. And the Christianity of the strikers posed a barrier of understanding for the communists, who were enormously excited. And we need to understand the Communist Party in St. Louis as a party in which there were many African-American members already. But we're excited to be working with and organizing this group of workers, and yet felt like somehow the strike was not sort of theoretically as evolved as it needed to be. And so I think that relationship between Smith and Sentner was a very, very powerful one, and one that I think culminated in a kind of an understanding among radical labor organizers like Sentner and his successor as the chair of the Communist Party in St. Louis, who was a Black custodian named Herschel Walker from Arkansas, that in order to organize and to work with the vanguard, the Black women who were at the front edge of the labor movement in St. Louis, they needed to back off their own understanding of those women's situation and to listen to the way that these activists theorized themselves. And so for me, then, that would be a story both of an extraordinary event and an extraordinary set of alliances, but also of a learning process.
When was this happening?
1933, I'm sorry. So
1930. So we're talking Great Depression, almost a century ago.
Right in the teeth of the Depression. And they were out. So a lot of the white women on the line at Funston Nut did not go out on the first day of the strike. Part of the issue, part of what was at issue was different pay rates between different parts of the line, and the different parts of the line were coded according to race. But by the end of the strike, which lasted for 9 days, a lot of the white women had also gone out. the largest Black women in St. Louis, won significant pay raises for the entire line. So again, there's a lesson to be drawn about the way in which these Black women's leadership in the labor market won an economic gain for all the women on the line, even those who were reluctant at first.
And this story goes against so many tropes and myths we have that are always recalled by the media and in popular culture, that during times of economic hardship, the races will turn on each other. What you're showing in this particular example in St. Louis is that whites and Blacks were coming together during a devastatingly difficult economic period. I think that would make an amazing film. I agree.
It's a beautiful story. No, I was just going to say there are unfortunately plenty of examples of the opposite in the history of St. Louis, but
sure,
we have enough movies about those.
So you mentioned the Vanguard, so I'm going to turn to Martha with this question. Do you want me to reiterate it, or do you remember it?
No, I've been thinking about it since you asked it, so thank you. I'm going to single out Mary Macleod Bethune. Growing up, Mrs. Bethune was a legend in my home. But it wasn't until I wrote this book that I had the opportunity to really immerse myself in her archive and appreciate the arc of her life. And it is the arc of her life, I think, that lends itself to a film. So I'm pitching it, Hollywood. She is born in 1875, toward the end of Reconstruction. A child of formerly enslaved people in South Carolina, and she lives until 1955. They are right at the advent, right, of the modern civil rights revolution. It's an extraordinary life. Bethune is an educator who founds a boarding school for girls, what is today Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona, Florida, at the dawn of the 20th century. She is a suffragist, organizing Black women as voters in 1920 in the face of extraordinary Ku Klux Klan intimidation and violence. By the 30s, she's in Washington, founding the National Council of Negro Women, befriending Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and helping Franklin Roosevelt found his Black cabinet. By the 30s, Bethune has figured out how Black women can, in essence, do an end run around the disfranchisement that had plagued her and many others in a state like Florida. She's going to learn how to use patronage and the power of presidential appointments to bring Black women into New Deal agencies that will finally turn their attention to Black Americans in the late 30s. By 1945, Mrs. Bethune is at the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco, part of a delegation that includes 2 African-American men who, while I'll leave them unnamed for the moment, don't really link arms with her. And so she takes an internationalist turn and discovers that her concerns and her struggles against Jim Crow and Jane Crow in the US resonate powerfully with women of color from across the globe who are grappling with apartheid, who are grappling with colonialism and more. And so this is a woman, right, who then tells us sort of an epic tale, really of nearly a century of American history, and helps us appreciate that long before Black women finally, in a state like Florida, will gain the vote by way of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, Mrs. Bethune is a politician who understands how to access and to exploit state power in the interest of Black communities despite disfranchisement. And so for me, she's someone who really helps us appreciate why the history of Black women and politics looks so different than perhaps the stock narratives that we've oftentimes been treated to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Alice.
These are such incredible stories, and it's hard to follow them, but the story that I think would make an amazing movie is the story of a woman named Matilda Hennis, who was enslaved by a man named William Cheney, who owned a plantation in Cheneyville, Louisiana, outside of New Orleans. And at some point, although we don't know when or how, Matilda Hennis was able to escape from Cheney, Louisiana, and make her way to Reynosa, Tamaulipas, in northeastern Mexico, where she found work in the household of a family run by a man or headed by a man named Manuel Luis del Fierro. And one summer evening in 1850, Manuel Luis del Fierro was outside of his house when two citizens from the United States came up to him and kind of made chit-chat, asked him if he wanted to go to a concert. Their band was playing in the plaza, and he said no, didn't give the incident much thought until later that evening when he was woken from his sleep from the sound of Matilda Hennis screaming. And he ran towards the commotion, grabbing a gun on his way, and he found those same two men who had asked him to the concert earlier that night, trying to kidnap Matilda Hennis, who he later testified in Mexican court had been held as a slave in the United States. And she is struggling. She is resisting being kidnapped. And Manuel Luis del Fierro helps her. He points his gun at those two kidnappers. One of them is able to get away, but the police manage to arrest the other, who happens to be none other than William Cheney, Matilda Hennis's enslaver from Louisiana. And William Cheney is thrown into jail in Reynosa, and the local judge of the Northern District of Tamaulipas begins investigation. He indicts William Cheney and begins to investigate him for this crime of kidnapping, which is this amazing. It was another amazing archival find to see Manuel Luis del Fierro's testimony before the courts. That's how we know about this event so much. And I just thought it was an incredible story of Matilda Hennis's ingenuity and resourcefulness, her own resistance to returning to human bondage in Louisiana, and the ways in which Mexican citizens sometimes risk their own lives to help protect those freedom seekers who had joined their households, joined their communities.
Thank you, Alice. And it's just fascinating to me because I often hear from people sort of involved in popular media that they're kind of tired of the old narratives, having to deal with the history of race relations and racism and African Americans in the United States. But each one of you is offering this fresh new perspective of ways that we can think about the past, and even heroes and heroines that we might be able to turn to give a new and fresh narrative to how we think about, the broader American past, right? North America, South America, all of the Americas. And I just really appreciate those responses and answers. We're running a little short on time, but I'd like to do one last thing before we turn to the audience questions. And that is, if each one of you had a question for one of your other panelists, I don't think we have time for you to each one of you to ask both panelists a question, but if each one of you could just think about a question you'd like to ask your fellow panelists about their work or what it was like doing their work, just to sort of open up the conversation a little bit. I'm going to start with Martha, if I could, if you had a question for either Alice or Walter about their work, and have them respond.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to ask Walter if I could, because I know enough about this book to know about your own personal connection, but I really wanted you to say more about that. We write introductions that sort of show one side of how we come to a project, but I wondered how long this book had been sort of brewing or burning, and why did you write it now? What was the trigger that led you to take it on now?
Well, the trigger was Ferguson and the uprising. And I had been invited to give a talk at Washington University in the fall of 2014. And because I am from Missouri, I'm from Columbia, about 2 hours to the west of St. Louis. I didn't feel like it would be right to go there and not to talk about Michael Brown and not to talk about what had happened in Ferguson. And so at that moment, the thing that I started working on, which was the political economy of Ferguson, I didn't think of it as a book. I thought of it as maybe this was grandiose, but I thought of it as a small contribution to the struggle there. And it was only after that, months after really, and after my wife told me, 73,000 times that I should write a book about St. Louis, that I sort of stuck in my thumb and pulled out a plum and said, what a bright boy am I? I'm going to write a book about St. Louis. I did, as I wrote then, I did really realize that this was a reckoning for me, a reckoning with a lot of things that I had heard about or felt or seen growing up, but that I hadn't understood. And so in a way, it is, almost an effort to sort of go through and catalog the archaeology, the architecture of my own kind of life in Missouri before I left when I was 17, and just figure out, well, where did all that come from? And then to try to share that in a way that was both really, really, I hope sort of unrelentingly honest, but also in a way, to say to people who aren't from Missouri or from the Midwest, look, we got a lot of radicalism out here. There's an aspect of it that's sort of about, you all have been sleeping on the Midwest a little bit, and to try to lift it up and amplify that history.
And then, Walter, is there a question you would like to ask either Alice or Martha?
Well, I'll go ahead and ask Alice. I mean, and this is a little bit unfair, but I am continually find myself learning new things and wishing that I had known them when I finished my book. And so what's the sort of set of stories or ideas that you feel like, you wish were in there and you're burning to tell us now?
That's such a great question. It's one that it's reassuring to me that it's not just me who has those things that you wish you had known in writing the book. And the one that really has hit home for me is trying to make sense of Mexico's decision in 1821, when it had secured its independence from Spain, to abolish all distinctions of caste and race. And that decision made my research quite difficult because it meant that none of the usual government records that can be so helpful for social history in the United States, like censuses, could be used to identify whether someone was a person of color, much less whether they were a fugitive slave from the United States. So it made my research hard, but when I was writing the book, I really felt like that 1821 decree abolishing all distinctions of caste and race was a good thing, that it made it harder for official discrimination to take root. But what I've realized, and a lot of this actually comes from my own students I'm teaching a senior thesis course right now, thinking about what does it mean when you categorize people or you don't categorize people. And one of the things that made that decision in 1821 not unambiguously positive was the fact that it made it that much harder to be able to see the distinct experience of African Americans and people of color in Mexico, not just for us historians, but for the Mexican government in general, that it made it harder perhaps to discriminate against those people, but it also made it harder to give them resources that would have helped them integrate more fully or succeed and thrive in Mexico. So I think I wish I had understood a little bit more the ambivalence of that 1821 decision.
And Alice, do you have a question for either Walter or Martha?
I do. My question, it could go to either of you, but I will turn it to Martha because, I'm very curious to hear. But Matt Jacobson, who's a historian at Yale, has been doing this really interesting project interviewing historians about creativity in history. Creativity is something that I think when we write books, we think about, but it's not something that we talk about very much or teach to our graduate students. And so I'd be curious to hear, Martha, what role creativity played in your research and writing process in this book.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, the first word that comes to mind is imagination, right? That, yes, as sort of Annalisa suggested at the outset, one way we could characterize what we do is, through the interrogation of evidence, and the assemblage of facts and their interpretation. But I'm somebody who I think needed a lot of imagination in Vanguard because I was trying to wholly envision US history from the perspective of Black women. And I was burdened, in a sense, by long-standing, powerful narratives, ones that, will ring, a bell, for even a casual reader, like Seneca Falls and the Women's Convention there, or Susan B. Anthony, or Alice Paul and her Women's Parade. There was a lot of heavy material. And before I could discover my own story, I think I had to imagine that there was another story there. I think that at the same time, for me, the most creative part of this book was to, in a sense, try and write without the footnote, at least not at first. To move away from that fidelity to the archive in its most literal sense, and to begin to fill in and insist that in order to tell the story I wanted to tell, I was going to have to imagine the women I was writing about as whole people. I was going to have to wring out of the archive things that were never intended to be a part of the record. And I was going to have to wrestle with a bit of creativity on the part of the women I was writing about, because many of them are self-consciously myth makers about their own lives. And I learned that politics requires, right, the construction of myth. Certainly the kind of electoral state politics that someone like Mary Macleod Bethune is so engaged in. So there was my creativity, but there was a lot of creativity going on in the archive, and how to sort through that and get to a history that I felt like I could stand with and behind was a great challenge.
Well, this has been such an amazing panel. It's been so rich and wonderful, and we only have 10 minutes left. And the one question I'm going to pick is a fairly complicated one. So if you could keep your answers as brief as possible, so each one of you could answer it, I would appreciate it. But I also want to thank the other questioners, and I'm just sorry we couldn't get to you, particularly Susan, Dwight, Tom, and Callie, for your putting in your questions and your thoughtfulness. I really appreciate it. But we are going to turn to Philip's question. So Philip asks, I would like to ask about 3 specific recommendations from each panelist on how to influence changes with the dominant culture's thinking regarding racism. And I think it's up there on the screen too. And I know that's a big question, but if you could try to respond to it as briefly as possible, because we do need to come in less than 10 minutes now. And if we could start with, we're going to do Martha, Walter, and then Alice.
Okay, that's the short straw, because that's a really great question. Thank you. The first thing I'd say is, in my work, is identifying myths, right? There are powerful myths that animate this country, myths about race, about racism, that I think have to be identified and labeled as myths. then I think there's no substitute in the work that we do for the archive, right? For constructing new stories out of the raw materials that animate history. And then finally, I think that we have to be forthcoming about our own moral, ethical, political concerns that bring us to the work and lead us to write our histories. At least that is the way that I try and work.
Thank you. Thank you. Walter.
I mean, I think for me, I very much like what Martha said. I very much like the idea of holding ourselves and one another accountable in a loving way, and really beginning at this point to be honest with you, for me, beginning to set about making change ourselves without relying upon state and civil institutions that I believe have failed so many in our society. So a very quick way of saying that would be to resist capitalism, to resist imperialism, and to resist the carceral logic that governs so much of our lives and so much of the way that we relate to one another.
Thank you.
This is a great question, and it's one that I wish I had a better answer to. I think we all wish we had the three things that would make this country better. I'm going to give just one because Martha and Walter have already given such good answers, and that is to make sure that our history education is capturing the complexity and the difficult events of U.S. history. I think that it's easy to think that history is not as important, that you can try to make this country better without having a historical understanding of the problems, that you can see the problems and try to fix them without that historical understanding. But I think that we really do need that history in order to understand both how deeply entrenched these problems are, what solutions have been tried and haven't worked before. And I think that there's no better reason for doing that than just the fact that the number of classes I have spoken to about this book, both at the college and the high school level, where students have said, I've never heard anything about this. I hope we could get to a point where students going through their education are no longer surprised by the history that all three of us are writing about.
Wonderful answer. Thank you, Alice. I would just add briefly that I think what I hear all of you saying is that in many ways, the answers are out there, that there are absolutely constructive things and even constructive histories that are out there. And maybe it's less about that they need telling and more about that they need listening to. And so I'm just really, really grateful for this platform, for all of your voices telling these. And I'm also grateful to you, the audience, for being here to listen. And I hope that you will go out and tell these stories, recommend these books to others, make films about them, because this is how the culture changes, right? Changing a sense of our past can really change how we think about our present and our future. And I just want to thank the three of you so much, Alice, Walter, and Martha. This has been a pleasure, and just for joining in this amazing conversation. And to the audience, don't forget to check out Skylight Books, where there are a limited number of signed book plates available for your book purchases. And we hope to see you soon. And we really, really appreciate your being here today and your supporting this exciting cutting edge work. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been fun to be with you.